Access Minnesota. Issues that matter to you. Access Minnesota brings you the newsmakers and the stories that shape our everyday lives, with analysis from University of Minnesota faculty experts. Now, here's Jim Dubois.
In 1971, DFL Governor Wendel Anderson worked with the conservative Minnesota legislature to pass significant fiscal policies that transformed the state's educational system. Though the process required the longest special session in the state's history, the bipartisan effort and the commitment to economic and social equality became known as the Minnesota Miracle. With the passing of Governor Anderson in July, we take a look at this monumental time in Minnesota's history and revisit the iconic 1973 Time magazine cover, where Minnesota became nationally known as the state that works. This month on Access Minnesota, Governor Wendel Anderson's legacy, the Minnesota Miracle, and what has happened to the miracle in the following decades. Tom Berg is a Minneapolis attorney who served as a state legislator from 1971 through 1978. He is the author of the book, Minnesota's Miracle, Learning from the Government That Worked. Tom, welcome to Access Minnesota.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
First of all, what was the Minnesota Miracle?
The Minnesota Miracle was a piece of legislation that passed in the 1971 session of the legislature when Wendel Anderson was governor. And in those days, you didn't have Republicans and Democrats in the legislature. You had conservatives and liberals, and the conservatives held both the House and the Senate. They were in control of that. And the bill made a huge change in fiscal policy for Minnesota. And what it did was it raised state revenues substantially. 23% was the final legislation of increase in taxes at the state level, but then decreased property taxes throughout the state and distributed that money back to the local units of government and the school districts. And it was such a profound change and so difficult to get done. It took the longest special session in the history of the state to get it done, but it got done. And then a group out of Washington said, that was a miracle, just a Minnesota's miracle, and the name stuck.
What was then Governor Wendel Anderson's role in passing the legislation that created the Minnesota Miracle?
He was absolutely key for it because it became a big issue. The property taxes were high, and the fiscal condition of the state became a big issue in the 1970 campaign. And a group called the Citizens League, that's still very active around, had worked hard on this, and they came up with a proposal to basically do what the Minnesota Miracle did. There were different twists, but it came up, and in October of that year, there was a Citizens League dinner or debate, and the two candidates were asked about it. And Wendel Anderson, the DFL governor candidate, said, I support it. Doug Head, the Republican candidate, said, oh, I have serious misgivings about it. And it became the main issue in the campaign. Wendel Anderson won with, I think, 54% of the vote. And so then he had to develop a plan to actually implement it, which was no small task because nobody had really thought about that part of it very much. So he was key to it, and he made the proposal, and then it took a long, hard battle to get it passed.
What were the political and economic circumstances in Minnesota prior to the 1970s that created the need for reform?
Well, in the 1960s, the Republicans had control of things, and Harold Levander was the governor, and they had passed a sales tax increase and gave some property tax relief primarily to the business community, but some and that was made permanent, but some to the general homeowner residential property taxes. Wendel Anderson campaigned on that and said that, listen, those taxes are going to go back up right away, and they did. And so by the time the election came in, property taxes were a huge issue there that led to fiscal things being one of the probably the most important issue in the campaign.
Let's talk for a moment about that protracted 1971 legislative session. Obviously a lot of rancor in the legislature, But how did Governor Anderson reach across the aisle and get the cooperation and buy-in from the conservatives?
Well, first, Jim, it was a miserable session. I was then a rookie in the minority party, my first year in the legislature. And the session came up and they couldn't get anything passed on that. In those days, you didn't have shutdowns, so they passed everything else but kind of left that open a little bit about what to do. And the governor called the legislature right back into special session. And then it went back and forth, and eventually the governor said, we're not getting anywhere here. What we're going to do is I'm going to have 10 people come over to the residence, governor's residence, not at the Capitol. And frankly, I think they were trying to keep the media away a little bit and some of the special interest groups probably. But they then had 6 conservatives and 4 liberals who met for weeks and months. But meanwhile, the legislature under the Constitution has to meet every 3 days, and unless both the House and the Senate agree. Well, and the House in particular would not agree to not meet. They were trying to put the pressure on the governor in particular to back down off of his proposal. And so those of us who weren't members of the 10 committee had to show up at the Capitol every 3 days and check in and say you were present, and then they'd adjourn the session, and then 3 days later you go do it again. It wasn't hard for me, I was from Minneapolis, but the rural people, that was terrible. They had to drive down, and there were people bunking in other people's house and sleeping on floors and all sorts of things. But eventually, the governor kept pushing. There were meetings there. Stanley Holmquist was the Senate Majority Leader, a conservative then, chaired these meetings. And he would just say, well, okay, I think we've got agreement on that, and then he'd move on to another topic. One of the interesting things, Jim, that wouldn't fly in today's world was no minutes were kept of those meetings. And eventually a compromise was reached. The liberals reduced the amount of the state tax increase and agreed that part of it could be covered by a sales tax increase, which helped pick up some conservative support. They put what are called levy limits on the local units of government, so they couldn't just go down with the property taxes right away and then raise them back up. They just couldn't do it. The state has authority to do that. And that picked up some more support, and eventually back and forth in some very difficult negotiations, why a compromise was reached, and in October, the end of October of that year, a final bill got passed that the governor would agree to, and the deal was done.
Some of the nation's more agreeable qualities are evident there. Courtesy and fairness, honesty, a capacity for innovation, hard work, intellectual adventure, and responsibility. That's a quote from the 1973 Time cover story on the good life in Minnesota. The article continues with this quote: by a combination of political and cultural tradition, geography, and sheer luck, Minnesota nurtures an extraordinarily successful society. We'll discuss the significance of the Time article with author Tom Berg.
Access Minnesota will return after these messages. You're watching Access Minnesota. Here's Jim Dubois.
More of our conversation with Tom Berg, author of Minnesota's Miracle, Learning from the Government That Worked. Let's talk about that famous 1973 Time magazine cover that pictured Governor Anderson holding up a fish with the headline, "The Good Life in Minnesota." What did this cover and the accompanying article do to boost Minnesota's reputation throughout the country?
Oh, I think it was a major coup for Minnesota and certainly for the governor to have that occur. And it was a picture, again, everybody's seen it, I think it was August 13th, 1973, in a cover of Time. And the article then did say Minnesota is a state that works, that the schools are pretty good, that the business community is good, that they work together, that it's a state with a strong environmental ethic, and all of those kinds of things that helped Minnesota, I think, very much nationally. And it was true. Minnesota generally did work. much better than things are in today's world.
Governor Anderson was described as a Midwest Kennedy. Did his youth and charm contribute to how people viewed the state and its government?
Oh, very much so. He and his wife Mary were both very photogenic folks. Wendy had been an Olympic hockey player. He played for the Gophers, and then as an Olympic hockey player, a silver medal team. And he had a style that was very good. And one of the things that I think of interest, and particularly in today's world where you have all this gridlock and people just aren't getting together, was Wendy and Mary put on a series of dinners over at the governor's residence. And they'd have 20, 25 legislators at a time, and their spouses would come over there for dinner. And there was no real politics talked. It was an elegant dinner, a social evening. The toasts were kept short, and everybody left with a picture with the legislators and the governor and his wife. And those kinds of things really helped get a bipartisan feel to things. They were, you know, we had our rancorous moments, big time, but his style and relationship building was, I think, very important.
Minnesota became known as the state that works. What was your experience in politics like in the 1970s? Did you think at that time that politics really did work?
Yes, I was extremely frustrated during that special session we talked about, because I said I didn't get elected just to do this stuff, go over and check in and check out. But then in the '72 election, for the first time in statehood, the Democrats took control of both the House and the Senate, and they had control of the governorship. And that had never happened with all three units of government together there. And then there was this explosion of legislation in the 1970s that had been kind of pent-up demand that came out. And environmental things, the Minnesota Miracle with its redistribution of money to local units of governments and school districts in a much more fair manner than had ever happened before. Consumer protection, the minimum wage went up. And it was done on a bipartisan basis, almost all of it. We passed the country's first major campaign financing and ethics bill. We had some sensible gun control legislation that eventually passed. And it was a state that worked, and it was fun to be a part of it as a legislator.
Tell us how the Minnesota Miracle's fiscal policies benefited the state, in particular with regard to education.
The money that came into the state then had to be redistributed, what I'm trying to say, out to the school districts. And that was done with some very complicated formulas. But in the past, so much of how school funding was done in Minnesota depended on the property tax base of each individual school districts. So if you happen to live in a community that had a taconite mine or an iron ore mine, or a big shopping center, or some other entity that generated a lot of property tax revenues, it was fairly easy to have pretty good schools that were well funded. If, on the other hand, you were in a bedroom community or some poor agricultural area that wasn't very good land, you had real trouble raising enough money for schools. And all of those factors were taken into consideration in the distribution of the money from the state back to the schools, so that it was much more equal. And that led to, I think, a greater compliance with the state constitutional requirement about a general system of education for the state. There were a lot of lawsuits in the country at that time, Jim, that were being brought that said the states weren't funding education very well. And the same thing is happening at this very moment in Kansas in particular. There's a big lawsuit pending there, and the Supreme Court of the state of Kansas is telling the legislature, you've got to do better, and there's a big fight going on down there, and the Supreme Court justices are up for election, and it is a brouhaha, the first order. And the Minnesota Miracle really spread that money out and made schools much, much better. You can talk to teachers and educators at the time. it just worked a whole lot better. Stanley Holmquist, the Senate Majority Leader that I talked about earlier, was a former superintendent of schools, and I think that helped get his support quite a bit. He understood how this worked.
A major and very popular component of the Minnesota Miracle legislation was property tax reform, in particular the so-called, at the time, circuit breaker or the property tax rebate. That continues today. How did that particular component in the legislation come about?
Well, the circuit breaker came in a little bit later after the Minnesota Miracle. It wasn't really part of that. But then it became clear that property taxes are a regressive tax. The economists use that term. And that people, you can measure what percentage of your income you have to pay for property taxes. And people on fixed incomes, retirees, and all pay a significant portion of their usually smaller incomes for property taxes. And people were then, as they started creeping up again, they would be taxed out of their homes, literally. They couldn't do it. And so there was developed a mechanism to try to reflect, break the circuit of all these things went, how you would show the correlation between those two taxes, income taxes and property taxes. And the formulas were developed to do that. And that is living to this day. There were actually some parties with birthday cakes and all not too long ago over at the state capitol about the use of the circuit breaker, the development of the circuit breaker.
What happened to the Minnesota Miracle? How did the legislative priorities start to change?
Well, after there was what I called there was the Minnesota Miracle in '71. There was also the Minnesota Massacre in 1978, when the Republicans won the governorship and both the United States Senate seats and the state auditor's office, and they got control of the House, or it was an even split on the House. Anyways, there was a major Republican victory that year. And then Governor Quee became governor, and they started making some changes in the tax policies of things. And they tried to use the inflation ratio for taxes, but not for the spending side of things. And it just didn't work. The two parts didn't come together very well. And so it started to run fiscal problems, and Governor Quee had to call several special sessions to balance the budget, because the states have to balance their budget by the state constitution. The federal government doesn't, but the states do. And so that caused problems as time went on. And then they chipped away at various things, although the basic concept is still in place. And I think that's an important thing to remember. And it's a big part of Wendel Anderson's legacy, of the idea of revenue sharing between the state and local units of government. And you can play with the formulas, tinker with them various ways, but there's still important formulas there and an important mechanism to help fund both municipalities and counties as well as school districts. Sometimes the local government aid, as it's called, or LGA, gets lost in the shuffle with talking about school districts. But that was part of the Minnesota Miracle, and all that's still there, and it's being talked about today, still, about the possible governor, the special session the governor may or may not call now, depending on how it works. And then there's fights about where the aid goes from the state level to what communities, and more than a little bit of politics gets played there.
By virtually all accounts, Wendel Anderson was the consummate retail politician. He was widely popular in the state. He, I believe, one election, he won every county in Minnesota. Just a phenomenal
He did in the '74 election, you're right.
He made one very fatal political error, however, and that occurred in 1976 when then Senator Walter Mondale became vice president with President Jimmy Carter. And he arranged a situation where Governor Rudy Perpich, then the lieutenant governor, would appoint him to the vacant Senate seat once he resigned his governorship. It did not go over well with the electorate, and many people have said it contributed highly to the 1978 Minnesota Massacre. How could such a savvy politician make a miscalculation of that magnitude?
A good question. I spent quite a bit of time kind of researching that and talking to as many people as I could about that when I wrote the book about these things. And I think it came down to Wendell Anderson loved public service, and he was very good at it, and he liked it a lot. And I think he realized that the shelf life of a United States senator is longer than the shelf life of a governor. And I think that's probably true in today's world too. The problems the governor faces are a little more direct and in your face to the voters in a state than a U.S. senator is. And he liked public life, and he thought he could withstand any problems that would come because of this appointment. He obviously did not, but he thought about it. He was advised about it. There were only a very handful of people who would ever had themselves appointed to the Senate like that and survived the following election. One of them, I remember, was Happy Chandler out of Kentucky. So he was aware of it, and I think just decided that, no, I think I can do this. I'm very popular. It's going well. And the Republicans did a very good job politically of exploiting that. And they would point out that we've got all these people in office who have just been appointed. They weren't elected. We're supposed to elect people in this country. We got a United States senator. Rudy Purbridge was never elected governor. He had been the lieutenant governor. He then became governor. And they exploited that a lot. And I think, Jim, there's a real kind of visceral feeling of people that we elect people to office in this country, high office, and we don't appoint them. And he violated that feeling.
The Minnesota Miracle transformed education in the state, but today, Minnesota schools have some of the largest racial inequalities in the U.S. What happened to the state's education reform, and how do we see the Minnesota Miracle in the context of today? We'll discuss the legacy of the Minnesota Miracle when Access Minnesota returns.
Access Minnesota will return after these messages. You're watching Access Minnesota. Here's Jim Dubois.
Back to our conversation with author and former DFL House member Tom Berg on the legacy of Governor Wendel Anderson. What do you think Governor Anderson's legacy and the larger legacy of the Minnesota Miracle is or will be?
Oh, I think Governor Anderson's legacy will be that he was a wonderful governor who got things done. He was very competent and got a lot of things done, including probably especially the Minnesota Miracle. And he understood fiscal policy, and he understood the role of local units of government. And I think that's very important. Most people don't. Most governors don't really get it. Wendy really got it. And hence that redistribution of the money in a fair, proper way was critical and made the state work, and that will live on. He also was a strong environmentalist, and there were so many environmental pieces of legislation that he proposed and were passed in the 70s that will live on. He stopped the dumping of tailings in Lake Superior. That was a big deal at the time. Grant Merritt was the head of the PCA. Environmental Quality Council was set up, Environmental Policy Act, the list goes on and on. So it was a major player in that, and he did things in housing and health care, and there's just a long list of things. So he's a governor, I think, who got things done.
Do we still think of the 1970s as a time when state government worked, or do we now see that perhaps the state worked only for some of its citizens and not all of them?
No, in the 70s, I don't think that it did. I think it was a state that worked, and we brought up with that school financing so many things. But if you're talking about today now, you can sure make the case that something isn't working very well in today's world. That's certainly true. But in fact, the thrust of the Minnesota Miracle was to make it work for everybody. Those poor school districts, those kids coming out of those districts where there wasn't a property tax base, cities that couldn't do their water treatment plants and all. That was a big part of the Minnesota Miracle, to make it work for everybody, rural as well as urban. There's always been a rural-urban split in the legislature, and always will be, I suspect. But Wendy managed to bridge that quite well.
With some of the largest racial disparities in the country, do we need a Minnesota Miracle Part 2? And if so, what might that look like?
Well, it may take a miracle, it seems like, at least at times these days, with the racial breakdown that seems to have been happening, particularly currently with law enforcement issues and all. I don't think you could have one piece of legislation that would solve all those problems. Fiscal things are certainly very important, and adequate funding for schools, for police forces, for prisons, for the whole justice system is a part of this whole thing, and you could handle some of that. But I think there's just a much broader cultural and societal change that's happened in the intervening years since the Minnesota Miracle, and now that is in a way, a more complex problem. And it's going to take a lot of work on a lot of different levels to do it. One of the big things, though, that I think is important is if you could have a Miracle Part 2 to educate more people about the importance of local governments, and that it isn't just whether you vote for Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton this election. It's who you vote for your city council, who you vote for mayor, who you vote for county commissioner, all of those things, because that's where so much, particularly now law enforcement, is set. I'm a former United States attorney here and I've worked on some of those issues. And you don't immediately run to Washington with all of these complaints. It's got to be solved some under our system of federalism at the state and local levels.
Tom Berg is a Minneapolis attorney who served as a Minnesota state legislator from 1971 to 1978. He's the author of the book Minnesota's Miracle, Learning from the Government That Worked. Tom, thanks so much for joining us on Access Minnesota.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure having the interview.
That's all for this month's Access Minnesota. We'll see you again next month. Thanks for watching.
Access Minnesota. Issues that matter to you. Join us again next week as we bring you the newsmakers and stories that shape our everyday lives. Access Minnesota is produced by the Minnesota Broadcasters Association in cooperation with the University of Minnesota's College of Liberal Arts.